Thank you, Karen. Hi, everybody. I'm Karen. I'm also Karen. We'll dominate tonight. I'm Karen Sibel, and I'm an alcoholic. Thank you, Karen, for calling me. My caveat for the night is that I have something. I'm sick with something. It's not COVID, but it's a thing, and it's really leveling me. And so I'm hoping that we can make it through here in the time without, sneezing and running and drooling and all the other things that's been happening to me in the last 2 days. Anyway, I'm very happy to be here. I have to tell you, this is a very civil meeting. I don't know if you guys get out to a lot of meetings outside this one, but I grew up in a meeting on the Upper West Side of New York, and it was literally known as the Wild Wild West. So I'm listening to you, and you're polite, and you're nice, and your readings are lovely, and you have volunteers. And I'm thinking, oh my God. I got sober on September the 8th, 1988. And I did get sober on the Upper West Side of Manhattan at a group called First Things First on 96th Street and Broadway. It remains my home group to this day. There are 4 meetings every morning at 6 o'clock, 7:15, 8:45, and 10 o'clock. This I think COVID did a number on my group. It used to be we met in the little room, held 34 people. And in those days, anybody who's old like me, sober like me, know in those days there were no cell phones and no computers. And so you just kind of showed up at the meeting and stood online to get in. And when they hit 34, they told you, wait. And you could smoke in the meetings then. And if somebody, walked outside for a cigarette, you lost your seat. And so that's the kind of room. Today, that meeting, First Things First, 6 o'clock meeting has over 200 people in it. And then the 7:15, which I go to a couple of times a week, has 100 people in it. So, and the in-person meetings are smaller. They're smaller. So I am coming to you bizarrely enough from where your former speaker Billy lives. I'm in DelRay, Florida, and I just moved here about I don't know, just a few months ago, and moved into where I am right here a month ago to my new place here. Started a new job on the same day that I closed on my condo, in the same week that I turned 70 years old. So if they say don't leave until the miracle happens, I mean, I'm literally walking proof. When they called to offer me the job, I said, that's great. Let me call you back. I'm closing on my house. And so in 1 week, and I think, who would have thought that would happen? I spent 9/10 of my life thinking I wasn't going to get it. I wasn't going to go very far, all the negatives. So anyway, it has been an extraordinary year. That's what I want to say. I'll go into my story a little bit, but it has been an extraordinary year of change and sobriety. I got sober in 1988 after drinking to the point and using to the point where I was on the streets of Broadway, walking around in my pajamas, eating out of garbage cans. And, I'm well educated. I'm a nice Jewish girl from the Upper West Side. There wasn't anybody in my family that had this. My father was an alcoholic, but, a classy one, we'll call that. And, how does that happen? It happens a day at a time. You look up one day and that's what your life has become. It's not like I woke up and I was running a company and then I turned around and I was, walking in my pajamas on Broadway. It just happens a day at a time. And by the time I came into Alcoholics Anonymous, I'd had a baby 18 months prior, and I'd had a massive physical stroke thing happen to me that the doctors blamed on alcohol and drug use. And, I mean, all of these things that happened that I just never attributed anything to alcoholism. And one day I was sitting on Broadway at a cafe with my husband, my son's father, my husband at the time actually, my story is filled with my husband at the time because I've been married 5 times, so I was always married to somebody. So my husband at the time, I was my son's father, and he was drinking Long Island iced tea, and I was drinking an iced tea, and I was fixated by the bead of water going down his glass in the heat. It was August, and I got sober in September, and I'm looking at it, and all of a sudden I heard this voice that said, "Get up, you're going to die." And I have to tell you, I'd heard that voice before, and it was always very comforting because I really didn't think I thought I'd be dead at 40. I had no idea how I was outliving, all of these things. But I was in my 30s at the time, and I for the first time, it didn't seem like a comforting thought to me. I thought, I don't want to die. And so I got up. I got up and I said goodbye, and I went to the apartment, and I came into the house, and, like I said, no cell phones, no computers. So I pulled out the yellow pages, and in New York City, Alcoholics Anonymous paid $3 for a bold listing in the yellow pages so that people like me could find their listing and wouldn't have to look very hard for it. And I found the listing for AA and I called them up, and I'm on 87th Street in West End, and the home group I went to was on 96th Street. 96th Street. It took me a week to get there. Every day I would walk a couple of blocks and I would get higher, I would drink, and I have to go back home. And then I would walk maybe a little bit more. I mean, the best things about New York are the worst things about New York, that the bars never closed and the dealers were on every corner, and I knew everybody. So it took me 1 week to get to the rooms of Alcoholics Anonymous, and I walked down the stairs, and this was called the little room. And you walk down the stairs, and on either side of the stairs was like the group of old timers, like the really old men. Sorry, guys, like the really old men that were there, because there weren't a lot of women, and they're smoking cigars and they're smoking cigarettes, and you go through the smoke like a gauntlet. Like you had to go through the gauntlet to get into the room. And I walked into the room, and some guy came over to me, and he said, "Why don't you sit down? You look tired." And I thought, how does he know? How did he know? I mean, I'm an alcoholic that didn't come into AA because I had pressure from the law or because my marriage was breaking up. I never cared about any marriage breaking up, you should know, but I didn't care about any of those things. I came in because I was tired. I was just tired. It's exhausting drinking and trying to get sober, and drinking and trying to get sober. I was a living, breathing step one for almost my entire drinking career. I would stop for a period of time and I would stay stopped, and then my skin would begin to crawl and my skin would get tight, and that spring in my stomach would start to wind up, and then my life became so untenable that I had to drink again, and I did this over and over again, and all it did was make me tired. So when I came into AA and I sat down, I said, maybe they will know. Anyway, I went for about a week, and I realized that this could not possibly be the place for me, because people were talking about extremely intimate things, which I didn't talk about anything intimate. First of all, it was none of your business. Second of all, they were talking about things that, when bad things happened to them, people were clapping and laughing. And when good things happened to them, they were sighing and they were like, just keep coming, just keep coming. And so I just kept showing up. And anyway, I figured out I needed a babysitter because my son was 18 months old and I couldn't leave him home. And my husband didn't want to take care of him. And so I got somebody at the meeting who was an active heroin user and said, here, you come into my house. You could eat everything you want and just babysit the kid, and I'll be back in an hour and a half. Those meetings were all an hour and a half long. And so that's what I did for about 4 days until I came home and my husband was there. And he said, no, this guy can't come back in here. And I went to go to the meeting, and he walked out of the bedroom with a big liter of Jack Daniels, because that's what I drank. And he took the bottle and he slammed it on the table and he said, here, drink this and get nice. I want to say that this is less than 2 weeks of coming to the program where I had such a change in myself, not that I could see it, but that he could see it, that he wanted me to drink so that I became malleable again, just malleable. Anyway, my son was in his stroller and he had his little, stuffed animal with his little teddy bear that his arms were around. And I took the teddy bear out and I gave him the bottle of Jack Daniels. He put his arms around that, and I started strolling down Broadway. And again, I'm so glad that I grew up in New York City trying to get sober, because nobody stopped, like child services didn't stop me on Broadway and say, why does this infant, why is he holding onto a liter of Jack Daniels? We just kept walking until we got to the meeting. And some old timer took the bottle of Jack Daniels, another old timer took the baby, and they sat me in the front row. And that's how I sat in there for a few weeks more. But like anything else, when we come into AA, it gets too painful once you reach whatever level you're at. And it wasn't exciting to me anymore. Nothing was happening to me anymore. And some guy came over to me after the meeting and he said, you better get yourself a sponsor because you're about to drink. And to me, a sponsor represented authority. And if you're an alcoholic like me, I had a tremendous problem with authority. When I hear how it works, I hear, what, an order? That's how I interpreted it. And so I found this guy, and the reason I took him was simple, because I came into AA and my love language was violence, because that's what I knew. And I came in, and once they got me out of the front row, I would come in the back row, and I would come into the rooms with a baseball hat on and sunglasses on. This is going to really date me. And a Walkman turned on to 10. So anybody who was near me could hear the songs that were playing in the Walkman. It's 1988 and the Pointer Sisters are playing. And I'd sit down and there's an old man sitting next to me, also with a baseball hat on. And he looks over at me and he's like pointing to this, that it's maybe too loud, but he hasn't really said anything. Next thing I know, he like pokes me and I went, okay, I get it. And then he turns around and he winks at me. Well, I got to tell you, I wasn't there to be winked at. It's okay if you tell me to quiet down, but don't you wink at me, because that's not what I'm here for. And because my language of love is hitting, I turned around and punched him so hard in the neck that he went down on the ground. Now, the love of AA is just, it's boundless. It's boundless because nobody did anything. They didn't stop the meeting. They didn't ask me to leave. The guy who was speaking kept speaking. The guy that I hit got up off the floor and he took a seat, put a seat in between us. He didn't sit next to me anymore. So there was an empty seat between us and he just sat down there. And at the end of the meeting, the chairperson came over and he said, Carin, you're an Alcoholics Anonymous. In these meetings, we keep our hands to ourselves. And I never listened to what they were saying because for some reason in that meeting, when they read all the rules and regs in the beginning of the meeting, they said, we keep our hands to ourselves in this meeting. So I clearly wasn't the first, but I also wasn't the last. And I said to him, you don't understand. This guy, he wanted me to turn down my Walkman, but he turned around, he winked at me. I said, I am not here for that. He said, let me introduce you to Don. Don has a tick in his eye. He winks at everybody. That's why we call him Winky Don. And welcome to Alcoholics Anonymous. And that was probably the first act of unconditional love I ever got in Alcoholics Anonymous. And I'm not saying I became friends with Winky Don, but I never hit him again. And maybe 4 years later, I was asked to be the speaker, what they call the big meeting in Manhattan. And that's an intimidating meeting. There's like 3,000 people that show up. And then they get somebody who really knows you to introduce you. And I didn't know who they got. It's like a surprise. And who do they get up there but Winky Don? I'm like, oh, what is the shelf life of knocking some guy out in AA? Well, I figured it out because he got up there and he introduced me as the middleweight champion of the Upper West Side. And that's how I had to give this talk on Serenity, 3,000 people sitting there. So, this is AA love all the way. Don was a part of the old men's group that used to go to the diner, after the meeting. We used to do the meeting after the meeting and the meeting before the meeting. And one day he turned around and he said to me, why don't you have breakfast with us? I said, that's a big honor, I tell you. I was a newcomer. They didn't ask the newcomers. And I sat down at this table, with all of these old guys and me. There were 5 old guys and I was the 6th person, the 6th woman, and they're all talking about whatever. And he turns around and he says to me, Carin, what do you want? And I thought, this is my big chance. Nobody ever asked me what I wanted. And so I started to get very emotional. And I said, what do I want? I want to stop drinking. I want people to be nice to me. I want to be nice to me. I'm tired of being hit. I don't want to hit anybody. I want what they have in here. And I don't know what to get. And I need all the help I need here. And he turned around and said, I'm talking about the menu. I never heard what they were really saying to me in AA. I always took it to the other side. Anyway, shortly after that, I met Albert Rogers, who became my sponsor for the next 15 years. And Albert and I had zero in common. I know they say the men with the men and the women with the women, but in New York, we are like not really good at following rules. And so I picked him because I'd heard him share, and he had come into AA with an enormous amount of anger. And he had been to jail because he tried to cut his wife's throat. His wife, Robin, who I love, she's like a black belt in Al-Anon. And because he thought she was having an affair. And he had fathered 12 children out of wedlock when he was drinking. And he didn't know where any of them were. And he had this reputation in AA of sponsoring 12 people at any given time so that one made up for all of these children he didn't know where they were. And I just kind of love that about him. Little did I know, by the way, that when you asked Albert to be your sponsor and he agreed, that there was fine print to the contract underneath that said, and you too will sponsor 12 to 15 people for the rest of your life. And it's been that way for me for almost 37 years. I sponsor between 12 and 15 people at all times. And even if when I move someplace, I bring all that baggage with me, all my baggage of sponsees with me. So they're all over there. They're all over the country and they're all over the world. And I've been doing it for years and it keeps you young in AA, I'll tell you. Anyway, I loved Albert. Albert was the first person that I ever met that listened to me. I don't know if you're an alcoholic like me, nobody really listened to me. Nobody was interested in anything I had to say. So when they're not interested, you do the only thing you do, you talk louder. And really, when they responded to me, they didn't say like, what are you talking about? They responded to me like, shh. That's how they talked to me. And so when I got Albert as a sponsor, he said, you only have to do one thing in this program, one thing if you want to stay sober. I said, what is it? He said, you have to be willing to stay sober somebody else's way. And I thought that was harsh. And I said, well, whose way is that? And he goes, anybody but yours. Anybody but yours. And that one piece of AA suggestion kept me sober all those years. That's the only thing I've ever listened to in AA. That I have to be willing to stay sober somebody else's way. That between me and my stuff, I can't see anything. I cannot see what's going on. But between you and my stuff, you can see it because it's air. So I had to have this person with me. Anyway, he said, you will, good sponsor, you will call me every day at 7 o'clock in the morning and we'll talk for 10 minutes and then you'll go out and you'll do your day. And we'll begin our days in a very sober manner after you've made your bed. He began to have me making my bed as my first sober act of the day. And so I did exactly what he said. I made my bed and I never called him. It didn't matter because he knew who I was. And so I would make my bed at 7 o'clock every morning. That phone would ring. I hated that. He had a sing song voice. And I, would say hello and he'd say, "This is Albert," and then he'd say, "Well, why don't you tell me what's going on today? Tell me what's going on with you and tell me what meetings you're going to." He was quiet. He didn't say anything for about 10 minutes. And I would tell him everything I was feeling. I was angry. You know how we are when we first come in. I was so angry. I was so resentful. I had all of these terrible feelings, but I would talk for about 10 minutes. And at the end of it, he would say to me, "Okay, that's enough for today. Don't drink, don't drug, go to a meeting, and we'll talk again tomorrow." And he'd hang up the phone. And that was it. I never got any advice. I never got anything at all. And we would do this every single day for a very long time. So about a year later, First Things First does this annual picnic in Central Park. It's not like a picnic where 20 people come. There's like, 500-600 people that show up at this thing because you come and you bring your family and you bring your sponsees or your sponsor, big, 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 thing. So I'm at the picnic and I'm with my third husband and he has a son and I have a son and we're a very happy family. And this girl comes over to me and she introduces herself. She said, "You Carin?" I said, "Yeah." She goes, "I'm whatever her name was." She goes, "You must be number 12. So I said, "What do you mean?" She goes, "Well, Albert's your sponsor." I said, "Yeah." She goes, "Well, I'm number 11. I wanted to meet you." I said, "Oh my God, how incredible is Albert? Don't you just love this guy?" First of all, I said, he never interrupts me. I don't know anybody who doesn't interrupt me. He listens to me. He doesn't judge. He doesn't tell me what to do. He just listens. And after 10 minutes, that's the end of it. And she looked at me and she said, Carin, Albert's deaf." I said, "What?" She says, "You didn't know?" I said, "How would I know?" Carin, he does the same thing to all of us. He calls every one of us. He says hello, what's going on? He takes his hearing aids out. He puts them on the desks. He sets a timer for 10 minutes. After 10 minutes, he puts his hearing aids back in and says, "That sounds good to me. Don't drink, go to a meeting, and we'll talk again tomorrow." And you know something? Even when I went to a second sponsor and a third sponsor, because I moved to different places, frankly, they weren't interested in anything I had to say either. It's the best way to sponsor someone. We're not interested in anything they have to say. They were all interested in what I did. It was during that time when I came to understand very clearly that there's no chapter in the big book called Into Thinking, or into talking. There is a chapter called Into Action. And that's really all they were ever cared about. They cared about is what I was doing in this program. So Albert sponsored me for my first 15 years and sponsored me through the whack on the head I got at 5 years sober. I did everything everybody said to do. I did everything. I came into that room and I announced my time every morning, and even though I didn't want to, because when you had 90 days, in those days, it was something special. You got a bronze token that said 3 months. It didn't even say 90 days. It said 3 months. And you got up there and you were the speaker of the group. And I mean, I did everything they said to do. And Albert was great. He held my hand through the whole thing. And we wound up, we never became friends. I just want to say this is a big caveat. Don't pick a sponsor that you want as your friend. Probably best to pick a sponsor you don't even like so that you actually hear what they're saying. I never wanted a sponsor who was, I don't want to go to the movies. I don't want to go to dinner with you. I want you to see the clarity that I can't see in my life. And so Albert was good for that. And anyway, I had gotten married again was 5 times married, only once in love, 4 times out of fear, once in love. And this was the one that I fell in love with like no other. And we had this phenomenal marriage. And anyway, we were trying to have a baby and we tried for 2 years and couldn't understand it because I had a kid and he had a kid and couldn't figure it out. And we both went to the doctors to figure out what was going on. And, I came back and I said, "Well, the doctor says I'm in great shape. I don't understand what's going on." He goes, "Well, my doctor says I'm not in such great shape. As a matter of fact, I have AIDS. And not only do I have AIDS, apparently I've had it for about 15 years. Well, if you want to see an alcoholic's entire world go upside down, I mean, it was an extraordinary thing that happened. I found this out in my 3rd year of sobriety, there are no words for the kind of life that we lived after that because it wasn't just the disease, it was the shame, it was the secrecy, it was the lying. Every time we had to go to the hospital, they wrapped us in plastic because nobody knew how you got the disease. We never found out how he got it. We had to protect the kids all the time. It was the only thing I did right during that whole time was not drink. I was going to 3 to 5 meetings a day. I had maybe, 2 or 3 years of sobriety. And, it was a really dark time. And, recently I think I told you I just moved to DelRay Beach and I uncovered all my books and put them in the shelves. And, again, sort of sorting them out, like put the cookbooks here, and put the political books there, and put the AA books here. And I found this book I didn't recognize, and it was a journal. And frankly, I thought I'd thrown out all my journals. I didn't need them anymore. And I saw this journal. It was those 4 years of this dark, really dark time. And, I wrote my first letter to God in 1992. A God I didn't believe in, asking him to fix something I knew couldn't be fixed. And if that is not alcoholism, I don't know what is. So it was a really, really dark time in those 4 years. And he got sicker and sicker and sicker. And I got sick. I didn't get sick with that. I got, caretaker sick, no sleep and not eating and dropping weight and just not taking care of myself because I lived in such a state of fear. I just didn't even think it was possible to be that afraid all of the time. And of course, making it worse that I was that afraid of something that hadn't even yet happened. Anyway, on my the eve of my 5th year of sobriety, I was going to be 5 years sober the next morning. We had a horrific fight because the tensions were so high in the house, and he was so out of it. And anyway, we went to sleep without speaking to each other. And I woke up the next morning, and he had left at about 2, 3 o'clock in the morning. He hadn't been out of the house in 3, 4 years, and he had left in the middle of the night. He had decided to go back to work. He hadn't been to work in years, and anyway, he came out of work because he realized he couldn't get into his office, and came back to the subway station, and the police arrested him because he didn't have money for the token. And all of these things are happening in God's way, I need to tell you, because they gave him a ticket because he had jumped the turnstile and he didn't have any money. And we said that we had the neighborhood people going out to walk, look for him, just like on the TV movies, like a Hallmark movie, a bad Hallmark movie. They started putting pictures of him all over the neighborhood, and I'm just sitting in the house, And somewhere around 3 o'clock, the police came and told me that he had jumped in front of the subway. When he came into the station, he was killed instantly, and they identified him by the ticket in his jacket the police had given him before. And there are moments, if we pay attention in AA, where we see the real markers of our sobriety. And it's not necessarily that, oh my God, I didn't drink. It's the actions that we take when something like this happens. The first thing that happened is that I instantly forgave him for what he did. Instantly forgave him. And then I picked up the phone, and I didn't call my parents. I didn't call my friends, and I didn't call my lawyer. I didn't call the doctors. I called somebody in Alcoholics Anonymous who now has 45 years sober. We still talk 3 or 4 times a week. And I called him and I said, Michael, he died. I don't know what to do. This is what happened. And he was very quiet. And he said, I want you to hang up the phone and go to a meeting that you've never been to. And when you get to the meeting and the speaker doesn't show, I want you to volunteer to speak. And that's exactly what I did. I hung up the phone and I went to a meeting, and the chairperson said, our speaker couldn't get here tonight. Would you volunteer to speak? Which is exactly how I got here tonight, by the way. Would you volunteer to speak? And I raised my hand because I've always raised my hand when that happened. And I got up there in the front, and there were my upstairs neighbors sitting in front of me. I didn't even know they were in the program. And, that was the beginning of, my kind of next life, because I came back home, and the police picked me up and took me down to the morgue. And I had to identify the body. And, I'd watched too much Law and Order to be sort of present for the whole thing. I was kind of televisioning it, the whole 9 yards. But what wound up happening to me was having a supreme spiritual experience that knocked me out. And I wound up breathing God in and never breathing him out. And, 30 plus years later, if I ever get afraid, which is very rare, I take that deep breath and I remember that God resides within me, that I do not have to look for him, that what Chuck C used to tell us, what you're looking for, you're looking with, and I know God lives within me. And that's what happened that night. And, when that happened, I instantly knew that type of an experience, to be able to give that out and talk about that, I couldn't do it for a long time, couldn't say anything at all for a long time. First of all, I didn't want you to think I was nutty. But the other thing was I didn't know what to do with the gift. I didn't know what to do with it. And over the years, I've learned what to do with it. And it has come back to me, 100-fold. And, I remember years later, maybe 25 years later, I got a phone call after a meeting one day. And this woman, Lucy, called, and she said, I just want to let you know my husband, John, died. I said, I'm so sorry to hear that. When did he die? Because that's what we say. When did he die? And she goes, right now, he's right in front of me. But I knew to make the call because I heard you make the call. And I did this for years and years and years in the rooms of Alcoholics Anonymous. So I want to fast forward a little bit because a couple of things that I want to touch on here. I've worked really hard in the program of AA. And the reason I've worked really hard is I had a great mentor. I've had great sponsors, but Clancy Imslin was one of my mentors early on, for about 10 years. And, I used to talk to him about my marriages, that I was such a loser and how come I kept getting married? Like, what's wrong with me? And he would say to me, Carin, nothing is wonderful once you get used to it. And I thought that was harsh too. But he was right. And he said, but I'm not talking about your marriages. I'm talking about AA. He said, you've been coming for a long time. And after a while, AA tends to get dull and gray. And you don't see the light that you used to see. And you don't feel that sort of pinkish cloud that you used to feel. And you see the same people and they say the same things and you go to the same meetings. He says, an AA ceases to be wonderful. And after it ceases to be wonderful for a while, then it ceases to be altogether. He said, you must do whatever it is you need to do to keep AA wonderful. And I said, well, what is that? What am I supposed to do? He said, it looks different for everybody, but I can tell you what it is more. That's what it is. So whatever you're doing, you got to do more to keep AA wonderful. And so that's been my credo all these years, whatever's going on. And when COVID happened, that really was a kick for me because I was able to start speaking online. We created 48 meetings on the night that COVID hit. Then we lost, and all these alcoholics came. Most of them came online, by the way, to yell at me for going online to begin with, that I was some kind of a traitor to AA for not going to in-person meetings. So, but we did 48 meetings immediately so that alcoholics, we were the first ones in New York to get online because everybody was trying to figure out what to do with life. And then I wound up speaking in other meetings in other parts of the country. And, it grew and it grew and it grew. And I was a speaker before this around the world, but coming into COVID allowed me to speak in places that I would never be. I am to this day the country speaker in the country of Iran. I speak in Tehran once a year. They don't even know that it's a nice Jewish girl talking to them about God. But I'm up there talking to them about God. And I look at the screen and every single square is black with Arabic writing because alcohol is illegal in the state of Iran. And if the police come in there under the guise of being an alcoholic and they see your name up there, then they come and they get you. And so there's nobody's there. I have never seen a single person. I talk 4 words at a time and then they translate into Farsi. And when I'm done with that meeting, I'm so filled with AA and the power and the beauty of AA because I give the same talk every year. All I do is run the steps. That's all I do. I go through all 12 steps and I do it once a year. And there's hundreds of people that are sitting in this room that come to listen because they can't get to AA meetings. They're not allowed in this. And I think to myself, this is how I'm going to keep AA wonderful. And I went to another meeting that was just so big. I mean, there was no like end to it on Zoom. They must have paid a lot of money for their Zoom account because there were like 25 pages worth of people. It just kept going on. And I said, the chairperson contacted me and said, there's this person in the room would like your number. Can I give it to her? And I said, of course, give her my number. And she made the mistake and posted it to everybody. So everybody wrote down my cell phone. And in the next 48 hours, I was hit with this infusion of AA. Of course, all they wanted to do was talk about themselves, but it was like this infusion of how fabulous AA was. It went away. And then I started posting my own number in the meetings. And I thought maybe I'll get it that way. Or I take on another sponsee, or I speak in another country, or I do something else. Right now, what's more for me is my home group here in Florida is a group called the Spiritual Principles. And they go through the principles of Alcoholics Anonymous. It's a 12-week series, and they get a speaker to do one principle every week. I don't know about you. I don't know anything about the principles, except in the 12th step, they tell us that we get them, but I never studied them. And so every week I have to talk about one of the principles. And it's funny because whatever the principle is, that's all I can think about. I can't think about anything else. And so last week it was faith, and that's all I thought about all week. And this week it's courage. So I'm, until Sunday, all I do is think about courage. So it's really been this extraordinary journey of more, and I know about more as an alcoholic. I know about more as a drug addict. More was everything, but more in AA means something else completely different. And so I do that, so COVID has been a blessing for me. On the other hand, I went back to in-person meetings with a gusto because I needed the hugs. I needed the hugs. I needed to hear when you were talking about me under your breath when I was in the room. I needed to hear if you were laughing. I needed to hear if you were tisking me. I needed to be around that. And as long as I could get to a meeting, I was going to go to a meeting. And, I live in Florida. I don't know if anybody else lives in Florida. Don't say anything. I mean, clearly they never thought there was any COVID here, so they didn't care. So they've had in-person meetings the entire time COVID was going on. So the meetings here are very powerful in person. And I just started to go from meeting to meeting to meeting. And so I got this infusion of people hugging me and welcoming me and calling me and how about dinner and let's get our nails done and all of the things that we know as an active sober alcoholic, that at the least of what we do is show up in these meetings. I feel so strongly when I hear people say, I do a lot of service, and doing service for me is going to a meeting. It isn't. Going to a meeting is the least amount of service that you can do. Going to a meeting and sharing and doing service at the meeting, that's service. Making sure when you go to a meeting that you raise your hand and you say, I'm here, I'm having trouble, or I'm here and I've never been here before, that's service, because there's some person in the back of the room or on some other screen who doesn't have the courage to say that it's their first time here or that they're in trouble or something else. So I've really come to a lot of terms with service of late. I still sponsor a lot of people. I sponsor men and I sponsor women, and I've sponsored them the same way that I was sponsored. I'm not interested in what anybody has to say. They call me a harsh sponsor, a tough sponsor. I don't really care what they call me. I tend to get a lot of slippers, people who can't figure out how to stay sober, because I know what my job description is. My job description is to help them find God and run the steps with them. And that's it. If I go beyond that, I have to sort of examine my motive. I go to conferences. I'm going to the international conference. I wouldn't miss it. But I guess the best thing that's happened to me since I got sober is that I wound up changing jobs. I was in politics for many, many years. Are you surprised? Not really. And after I finished working in politics, where it wasn't fun anymore, I just wanted it to be fun. I began to work in the professional Jewish world. I'm literally a professional Jew. I don't know how else to say this. And I wind up working with legislators, and I work with people in the community, and I take a lot of them to Israel so they can see the country and not be so scared. And I've been doing this for a very long time. But frankly, when I take these people there, they don't have to be Jewish. They just have to have never gone before. And when I go there, they annoy me because I'm an alcoholic, and left to my own devices, I'm not talking to you. I'm not talking to other people. I'm not anybody, and they would annoy me. And they spent a lot of money to go on these missions with me. And we would take them around and take them around. And one mission in particular was we were in Jerusalem, and they were so annoying that I called Intergroup, and it was Saturday, it was Shabbat. And nobody answers the phone on Shabbat because the whole country closes down. It's really hard to imagine. We used to do this in this country Sunday when everything would close on a Sunday. Saturday in Israel, everything closes. So I called Intergroup like 10 times and nobody answered the phone. And finally, this woman answered the phone, and she was the Christian roommate of the girl who ran the Intergroup program. And she said, what do you want? And I said, I need to get to a meeting, like immediately. I need to get to a meeting. She said, okay, I'm gonna send a safe cab for you. And a safe cab is a cab that would pick me up, and I know that I would get to the place I was going, like they wouldn't take me anywhere else. And so this cab picks me up, and I give him the address, and he said, are you sure you want to go there? I went, this is where I'm, so they told me to go. So I get in the taxi, and he drives down, and there was really not a lot of people on the street anyway, because it's Shabbat and people with their families. But when he dropped me off in this place of Jerusalem, I absolutely knew I shouldn't be there. This is not a place that I was supposed to be, and I no longer felt safe. And I got out of the cab, and I began to talk to the cab driver, and he just drove away. He didn't even want to be there. And I'm standing on the street saying, I have no idea what to do now. What is supposed to happen to me? And all of a sudden I see this woman running down the street. And I know from her dress that she's a Muslim and she's Palestinian. I can see it by how she's dressed. She's running down the street and she's yelling, are you Carin, the alcoholic? The top of her lungs. And I'm like, yes, that's me. And she runs down, picks me up. She goes, I'm here to take you to the meeting. And she takes my hand. And in Israel, in the old city, which is where we were, everything is Jerusalem stone. So we're walking down lower and lower and lower, all these stone steps. And we wind up in this room at the basement of a synagogue. And I walk in this room, and frankly, I couldn't believe what I saw. I mean, it would never happen in any place outside of Alcoholics Anonymous. There were ultra-Orthodox Jews there who are not allowed to talk to anybody, anywhere. And there were Christians there, and there were Arabs there, and there were full Muslims there, and nobody was really talking to anybody else because they're not allowed. And on the outside world, when they're not at an AA meeting, they're probably trying to kill each other. But in this room, we had a bigger enemy than anything that's going on in the real world. And we sat down in a circle, and they began to talk about alcoholism and the solutions to alcoholism. And when the meeting ended, the chairperson got up, And he said, now we're going to stand and hold hands and say the Serenity prayer. And I thought, well, how the hell are they going to do that? And people stood up, and every woman reached into her pocket and took out a glove. And she held on to the glove, and the person next to her held on to the other side of the glove. So nobody touched. We made a circle, and we said the Serenity prayer. And I thought to myself, first of all, I've discovered world peace. Clearly, it's anonymous, but I've discovered it all by myself. We're in this room of AA. And second of all, I thought there's no program like this in the world, not in the world. And I know why now, because no matter what the differences are, the reason that we're safe in these rooms, the reason that we're safe from harm in these rooms is that every single person comes in here, whether they like it or not, with their own version of a higher power. And if you're sober one day, you didn't do it yourself, because if you would have, you could have. And you didn't. So there had to be a God in there somewhere. And everybody comes into the room with their version of God. And so in this room tonight, we have 118 gods in here with us. You think there's a safer place to be anywhere? That's what makes Alcoholics Anonymous such an extraordinary program. I'm only here today, by the grace of God and because it works. I work hard. The program works. I've had a love affair with AA for over 30 years. It sure lasted longer than any of my marriages. But AA has been the one for me. So I thank you so much, Carin, for having me in. And it remains a great day to be sober. Thanks for having me tonight.